sit down, please. C'est un vrai plaisir de vous avoir avec nous. Un peu de Larsen, ça arrive. Murphy est dans la salle.
I'm getting... Okay.
Ben voilà. On y va sans micro. C'est un vrai plaisir de vous avoir avec nous. Comme je le disais en introduction, votre film est un essai cinématographique, en fait. La première question, mais c'est une plaisanterie, non, mais vous avez quand même dû avoir un énorme budget pour pouvoir organiser ces manifestations et les filmer. J'aimerais quand même vous reprendre sur cette nouvelle configuration, un peu de documentaire. Vous avez écrit un essai, en fait, vous avez filmé un essai, c'est ça? Vous êtes de background, vous êtes sociologue, et puis vous choisissez le cinéma, tout d'un coup, pour exprimer ce que vous avez à dire sur la démocratie. Pourquoi ce choix du cinéma?
Thank you all for coming. Thank you very much. Thanks for hosting. We really appreciate it. We're really excited to be the opening film at this incredible festival. So thank you, everybody. In terms of why make a film about this, I have an academic background. I was originally a graduate student at Harvard studying sociology, as was my producer Patrick, who's around here somewhere. And upon leaving, there were so many ideas in the academy that I was really passionate about, but I knew that ordinary people, the wider public, were not familiar with. And so what I decided to do was to transfer into film and to sort of get into storytelling. And I think really what storytelling is fundamentally about is really about metaphors. And so really what I wanted to do with this film was to sort of search for a metaphor that could maybe sum up how we were feeling. And this was all the way back in 2014. And so what we sort of settled on was this sort of idea of the wolves, the rise of this new class of political leaders. And so Patrick and I and our team went all around the world to kind of explore this new form of government that we saw that was emerging, but we didn't quite understand yet.
Let me go back to what you just said in terms of the storytelling. So that's a choice. Is it because you think that traditional storytelling, which for an academic would have been writing an essay or doing some research, is not actually adequate today to tell the story, particularly the story of democracy?
I don't think it's adequate on any day. I think the history of storytelling, in Western culture, we kind of go back to the Greeks. It's all about metaphor. It's all about symbolism. I think that's how we communicate to each other. When you think about these big ideas, human rights, institutions, democracy, the rule of law, freedom, they're abstract. They're not things that we sort of tangibly feel in our day-to-day lives. And so what we tried to do with this film was to look at what we could call, say, the practice of freedom. It's not about, we decided not to look at freedom as a philosophical idea. We could have said, what does freedom really mean? What is the true meaning of freedom? We didn't ask that question. We said, how is freedom practiced? When people do freedom, what do they do? And so we try to look at the lived experiences of ordinary people, and then to make sense of that was to then turn it into a story and to kind of find a metaphor, in this case, this idea of the rise of the wolves, to kind of tie it all together into a form of popular storytelling.
What's interesting is that the freedom you're talking here is indeed the freedom that's conditioned by, of course, the places where it occurs. And all those places are essentially living under a different sense of what freedom is all about. There is repression, there is oppression, there is an assault on basic human rights. So you didn't go for the freedom like, say, in Switzerland. You went for that confrontation between the practice of freedom, as you said, do freedom in countries where that space for freedom is being reduced or suppressed.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as you sort of we see a range of different cultures. And, when we started making this film, we actually thought we were going to find a huge amount of diversity, right? So there's a saying about anthropologists who go out and do work all over the world. And there's a saying that says, half of anthropologists go all around the world and are amazed at how different everybody is. And there's another group of anthropologists who go around and are amazed at how everything's the same. We started out as the former group. We were expecting everything to be different. And no matter where we went to, whether it was a Muslim country such as Tunisia, an East Asian country such as Japan or Hong Kong, or Western countries such as the United States, we actually found that when people, practiced freedom, they were in these struggles, they were actually fighting for the same basic things against political corruption, for freedom of speech, and for meaningful and fair elections.
But then it is indeed about power and our ability, individually and collectively, to change the structure of powers. And what you're showing here are a situation where the power has not been shifted, has not been transformed. How do you go, and what is your take on this is what it will indeed take to fundamentally alter the structure of power?
That's a good question.
Thank you.
That's a good question, and I've thought a lot about this. When we sort of interview people, regardless of whether in all these different countries, Hong Kong or the United States, there's kind of a perception that we've sort of been told, which is that if you're unhappy about something, you need to go and protest, and you need to go and kind of change the system, and then people become very disappointed when they do a protest, and the next day or the next week or the next year they don't see any change, and they say, well, what was the point? What was the point of that protest? And for me personally, I like to look back to sort of one of the modern fathers of civil disobedience and protests, which was Martin Luther King. And Martin Luther King famously said, the arc of history is long, and it bends towards justice. And I think this is actually misunderstood by people. People say, oh, well, it bends towards justice, so everything is going to kind of go in sort of the correct direction. If we just show up and we do enough stuff, then everything will kind of work out in the end. And they ignore the first part of that sentence, which is the arc of history is long, right? This isn't, you're not going to see immediate changes when you look at the civil rights movement in the United States in the post-war period in the 1950s and 1960s. This was a 2-decade-long struggle, and there were lots of setbacks. There was backlash. But ultimately, with the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act, there were achievements, and of course, as we know, that didn't solve all the problems far from it. There's another great leader, of course, Mahatma Gandhi. And we think about the struggle for independence from the British Empire in India. And you sort of see that sort of starting with the first big civil unrest in India starting in the 1860s. India gets its independence almost a century later in the late 1940s. So I think we need to go out to protest, we need to have civil disobedience, but we also need to keep in mind that the time frame must always be long.
Say, if you're an Egyptian or Tunisian, if you lived under an authoritarian regime for years, don't you expect that once you think that indeed the regime has been overthrown, it's going to be a quick change?
You're correct. That's absolutely an expectation that people had, and we sort of saw in the Tunisian segment of the film. But this is just really the beginning. Things in Tunisia are definitely better now than they were under the dictatorship of Ben Ali. I don't think anybody really disputes that. But the government that they sort of got now underneath KG Baidesebsi is not really a liberal democracy either. They're in this kind of middle state, this kind of fake democracy, or illiberal democracy as the academics called it. So there's been some progress in the struggle, but it's definitely far from over.
From all the people you talked to, all the people you saw, from all the people you saw and talked to,
It's just take mine.
From all the people you talked to, the people you saw and interviewed over the course of filming Freedom for the Wolf, are you hopeful that indeed the yearning and the ways and the practices of doing democracy, as you say today, in the end will win the day? Because it looks like we're teetering almost on, going into a massive regression, or being able through new ways, new approaches to win, or at least to consolidate this battle for values that we share.
I've got two parts to that answer. The first one is that when you look at the history of let's just say Western democracy to make it a bit simpler, we've had periods of growth and periods of recession. There was a massive period of growth in the 19th century and the early 20th century, And in the 1930s, we had a massive recession in some places like Spain, and that lasted until the 1970s. So I think we definitely have seen these sort of ebbs and flows, and one of the reasons of that is because of nationalism. Nationalism and democracy have kind of always gone hand in hand, but unfortunately nationalism has this sort of darker element to it, which is inherently illiberal, it's inherently majoritarian. There's always this temptation for political operatives, in the words of the American conservative James Pat Buchanan, when he was an advisor to Nixon, he said, "Let's split the country in half and we'll take the bigger half." That's always going to be a temptation, unfortunately, in democracies that will last, not just through this recession, but through many more in our lifetimes and the lifetimes of our children. In terms of is there hope, at the end of this film, we finished on the Women's March in Washington, D.C. And again, the expectation there wasn't that Donald Trump was going to resign the next day. But instead what it did is it built organizations, it built platforms, it built spaces for women to talk about issues, not just around sexual harassment, but around equal pay and so forth, that didn't previously exist. And what we saw merely 6 months later was the birth of the Me Too movement. We've seen a huge resurgence in a new kind of feminism with new leaders in the United States and indeed all over the world. So I think change is happening, but it's not necessarily always happening in the ways we expect it to.
Thank you. We're going to go to the audience. I think there are mics circulating, open mics, I hope. Circulating I'll give mine. Non, I'm fine. Ça va, moi. Comme d'habitude, si je peux vous demander questions, toutes les questions sont ouvertes. Profitez, c'est une expérience. Vous avez un cinéaste formidable ici qui va vous partager son expérience. Qui veut poser la première question? Elle peut être liée au cinéma, elle peut être liée à la démocratie, elle peut être liée à l'animation, au storytelling. Madame? Allez-y. C'est la première soirée, on a un peu des teething problems encore, mais ça allez-y en anglais, allez-y.
Wow.
Thank you. So I'm fascinated by what you just said about the women's marches providing an opportunity for women to talk about, for instance, sexual harassment. I'd like to point out that, in fact, the motto of the women's marches outside of the US was, "Women's rights are human rights, and we are fighting for equality, diversity, inclusion, and a focus on the climate." So interestingly, a forum, and I agree with you, organization, opportunities, platforms were provided on a range of issues, and that brings me to the idea of intersectionality. And my question for you as a community organizer is, when you talk about storytelling through film, is there a way in which you are intentionally using storytelling to address, for instance, intersectionality? Thank you.
Sorry, am I using it, or can we use it, or?
Yes, when you talk about storytelling, which is one of the 5 basic practices of community organizing,
Okay,
I'm fascinated by this idea, and I wonder how, yes, for instance, first of all, what your concept is of intersectionality, as I've just described it in the context of the Women's March, and how you, as a storyteller, address these kind of concepts.
Okay.
Thank you.
Let me just think of something to say about that. It's a great question. It's a difficult one. In terms of storytelling, as you know, as a community organizer, like personal testimony is absolutely key. And indeed, the Me Too movement began with personal testimony, right? It began with a few high-profile cases of women telling us their stories about sexual harassment and how they were silenced and how they were bullied and how they had lawyers called on them and how they had their careers ruined and so forth. And as you know, that's always been a key part of community organizing, and that will always continue to go on. In terms of metaphors and storytelling and intersectionality, I think what we're going to start to see is emergence of these kinds of metaphors that can link different people together and can kind of make our stories universal. That's always a tricky issue for these kinds of films. We made a film, filmed in five different countries, and some people said, well, will the audience be able to relate to this, right? That was a question we kind of got. This isn't really about, at least at the beginning, it's not really about Europe at all, it's not about America at the beginning. But one thing that we sort of found was the testimony of the father in Tunisia who had his kid. He didn't know where his kid was. His kid could have joined ISIS, could be kidnapped by ISIS. He didn't really know. We started screening this film. Anybody who was a father, and especially Americans, they totally related to that. There's a kind of a universal human experience of worrying about your kids and not knowing where your kids are. So for me, intersectionality is about kind of crossing those boundaries. And I think it's partly testimony and it will be partly metaphor as well.
Yes, there was an aspect in your movie that was pretty striking. You were talking about the misperception of democracy, for example, because I like democracy because it allows me to go shopping, to this kind of consumption democracy. How do you explain that? Is it some kind of complacency towards the merits of democracy? Is it a generational thing? How do you explain that?
I think what's fascinating about that phenomenon is that it's global, and so we need a global answer. And I think it's almost like I think the rise of sort of consumers around the world, some people see as a really positive thing. I know Stephen Pink has just written a new book about this, defending the Enlightenment and defending economic growth. But you've also got people who are sort of experiencing sort of consumerism and these consumer freedoms for the first time. And this is extraordinarily powerful. I really think that as people who work in human rights and work on these issues, it's very easy to kind of belittle that. But I think that these personal freedoms, of which consumption is one part of it, can relate to all kinds of parts of our personal lives. So it can just not be just buying a car, it's driving the car. It's these sort of experiences that we're getting from consumerism, which when people experience for these first time, are extraordinarily powerful. And unlike things like human rights, voting, especially protections for minorities, these things can be sort of abstract, and these things you don't necessarily know that you're missing them until you are that person. And that's why we included the Japan story, because Japan was such a fun example of a sort of
narrating with the wolf and sheep cartoon, because that's a very extreme cartoon, which is kind of one-sided. So, and I wanted to ask you why you choose this form of showing what for determination we live through, maybe. And also another question is, there's this definition of freedom you have in your movie, and it's maybe not that personal individual freedom you're talking or you're showing. So the question is, what do you want to show, or what is your intention with the cartoon? That's my interest. So I'm a movie maker, and I wanted to know what this wolf and sheep.
So I sort of said at the beginning, it's just a metaphor, right? This is just a way that we can tie together these disparate experiences, right? We made a film about 5 different places because we wanted to show how the same phenomenon was a global thing. And you can use words like illiberal democracy, you can use words like fake democracy, and we did that, and we had screenings, and it just wasn't quite gelling together for the audience. And we realized that the message of the movie couldn't be described just in words. We needed not just metaphors, but we needed visual metaphors, a language that could tie it all together, and one that was also open to interpretation. So I wouldn't say that the cartoons are deterministic, I would say that they're glue.
Thank you very much for this amazing movie. I'm a master's student here at the Graduate Institute, and I believe that in this time of hyperglobalization, social media, and fake news, mainstreaming academic knowledge is a key activity that academics should be doing, and you've done that nicely, gorgeously, and I just wanted to ask you how to do more of that, what techniques can we use besides metaphors and storytelling? How do you see this going further? Because that's what academics should be doing as well as research.
Well, to be fair to academics, it's not their job to do this. You know, academics do what they do, narrow research questions, and they try and answer those questions as sort of scientifically as possible, and you know, that's their job. Jobs as filmmakers is to take not just one study, but to take lots of different studies and sort of tie those together and say, okay, there's a body characters to kind of bring that to life.
Hi. I had a question about your filmmaking process, because you have footage that starts all the way in 2014 and so on. How was your selection process? Did you first look at the different countries that were showing these kinds of patterns, or was it a more evolutionary process?
It was an evolutionary process, and I have to keep my answers short. So the quick answer is, you know, there's a lot of skepticism that the Chinese even believe in freedom at all. So that was a good reason to go to Hong Kong. Hong Kong failed. We wanted to go to a place where a revolution had succeeded. That was Tunisia. When we were there, we realized the kind of democracy that was emerging was this thing called a liberal democracy, which we look at in the film. India is the world's biggest democracy. It's also becoming a liberal. I'd mentioned Japan earlier, and America's America. So that's the quick answer for five countries.
Yes, up here. Thank you so much. It was a really, really illuminating, but I would say also very depressing film. My question is...
Sorry.
Yes. My question is, you know, what kind of democracy? I mean, I think here in Switzerland, people will say direct democracy, as they live it here in Switzerland, is the way it can work, but it can only work in a small country like Switzerland. It can't work elsewhere like that. And one questions how you can return to the real essence of democracy when we have such a complex world.
That is a very good question, and I think of a short answer to that. I think coming from the UK, we almost have the opposite opinion. We feel we've got too much democracy, right? We're suddenly sort of having these referendums that have been producing all kinds of very controversial results, which we now have to live with and figure out what this even means in a proudly parliamentary democracy. We now have referendums. I think the problem with sort of globalization and global governance is that there isn't necessarily a democratic solution to it, right? We're not going to have a global parliament to it. Even if we did, it would be captured by, special interests. So I don't have a good answer for you other than to say that I think that, like, coming from the UK's experience, and you mentioned with Switzerland, you know, I think each of these sort of at least Western democracies have got respected, legitimate, democratic institutions, which we had and are now being eroded. So I think for the short term, we should, you know, try and go back to what's worked for us in the past in each of those countries.
Bonsoir, je vous remercie de votre film et je voulais vous poser la question pourquoi vous avez choisi cette musique. Ça m'a un petit peu dérangée personnellement parce que j'y avais beaucoup à voir, à lire, à se concentrer sur les textes et ça fait beaucoup de stimulation ensemble. Puis la deuxième question, est-ce que vous ne pensez pas dans la démocratie, il y a aussi un devoir dans la démocratie, c'est de protéger les plus faibles, les plus démunis et de faire respecter les droits humains. Et comment on en est tellement, tellement loin de nos jours. Et puis maintenant, on a l'impression que ce qui prend la place, c'est le gagnant. Le gagnant, il peut tuer, il peut faire ce qu'il veut, mais il gagne. Voilà, c'est ça qu'il faut. Et ça, c'est très, très inquiétant. Voilà, je voudrais vos commentaires là-dessus. Merci beaucoup.
Well, on the first issue, I like the music, so I'll put that into taste. The second question, I totally agree. You know, in India in particular, we look at this kind of majoritarianism that's taken over the country, and of course it's not unique to India. And as I mentioned earlier, I really think that this is endemic to democracies because democracies are tied to nationalism. And any kind of savvy political operative, and I mentioned Pat Buchanan earlier, has a temptation to divide the country. Britain is now bizarrely sectarian, and it's only been like this for, what, a year? Not even? A year and a half? I can't remember. A year and a half. We're now sort of divided into kind of Brexiteers and Remainers, and people are very emotional about this and very upset about this. This didn't even exist 2 years ago. So what I find really striking about the world that we live in is just how easy it is to kind of sow these divisions. And unfortunately, I feel it is endemic to democracy. Democracy, as you say, needs to have its liberal component. It needs to protect liberties. It needs to protect minorities. Otherwise, a democracy isn't going to have any freedom at all. Absolutely, and I think that, you know, that's also why we don't, you know, state exactly which rights and freedoms people should or shouldn't have, and that's a big part of the debate around democracy. And there's no version of thought that all liberal democracies have to be homogenous and identical either. Having said that, I do think we need a definition, and personally, I like a conservative and very limited definition, so it can be as universal as possible, which is free and fair elections, getting, you know, the word for uncorrupted, uncorrupt political process, protections for minorities, freedom of speech, the rule of law. So I think if we can keep the definition of liberal democracy as kind of simple and as narrow as possible, it can then be as universal as possible as well. Well, a mixture of both, clearly, from the film. I think we're in a really dangerous position, and I think that, you know, the rise of nationalism globally as an answer to other problems, whether it's economic deprivation, whether it's an answer to the refugee crisis, is clearly not the right answer, in my opinion, to those problems. But at the same time, nationalism's a very old problem that we have to face. And I think that the hopeful part of me is that in Europe, we went through this in the earlier part of the 20th century, and okay, we didn't have the best solution to it. It was, the human cost was unfathomable and should never be repeated, of course. But at least in the absolute darkest days of the 20th century, there was light. So there's no reason to believe there shouldn't be light today either.
Thank you very, very much, Rupert Russell. Thank you. Sound round of applause. Merci, merci beaucoup. Merci. Pour ceux d'entre vous qui restaient pour le discours du haut-commissaire, je vais vous demander une petite faveur, c'est ça va commencer à 8h30, mais nous aurions besoin de libérer les 2 premiers rangs Donc si je peux vous demander de vous regrouper soit sur le balcon, soit là où il y a des places libres, de manière à ce que ces deux premiers rangs soient libres. Merci infiniment. Vous pouvez sortir, si vous sortez, marquez votre siège, c'est prudent. Et donc je vous retrouve d'ici un quart d'heure avec le haut-commissaire pour une discussion et un discours. Merci.